125th Street, in the autumn of 1946, had a particular kind of breathing to it. Not the frantic pulse of a city trying to prove something, but the slow, settled rhythm of a neighborhood that had been here long before the rest of the world noticed, and intended to be here long after. The air carried jazz from open windows, not performed jazz, not the kind people paid to see, but the kind that spilled out accidentally, the way a good thing tends to overflow when a room gets too full of it. Women moved down the sidewalk in church hats even on weekdays, because some women understood that dignity is not a Sunday appointment. Men stood outside barbershops in pressed trousers, discussing everything and deciding nothing, and somehow keeping the whole block calibrated. Corner kitchens sent the smell of hot food into the street like an open invitation, and the street accepted without hesitation. This is Harlem, autumn 1946. The war is over. That is the first thing worth saying clearly. The war is over. The boys came back, some of them whole, some of them quiet in ways they hadn't been before, some of them carrying things in their eyes that no one at home had the vocabulary to ask about. But they came back, and Harlem received them the way it received everything, with noise and food and women crying the good kind of tears on front stoops. But this story is not about the war. The war ended overseas. This story is about what happened when a soldier came home and discovered that some enemies don't wear uniforms. Some enemies wear aprons. Some enemies stand behind counters on avenues in the very neighborhood that prayed for their safe return. What unfolded that autumn on 8th Avenue was not loud. It did not make the newspapers. There were no speeches, no photographs, no official record of any kind. But Harlem remembered it. Every barbershop remembered it. Every church pew held the memory of it. Every numbers runner from Lenox Avenue to St. Nicholas carried it like a coin in a coat pocket, small, unremarkable to the eye, but always there when you reached in. A man was refused, a community was insulted, and Bumpy Johnson was watching. His name was James Caldwell. Most people who knew him called him Jimmy, and most people who called him Jimmy liked him without quite being able to explain why, which is usually the mark of someone who carries their goodness without advertising it. He was 31 years old that autumn, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from labor rather than vanity, quiet-spoken, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned early that the people worth talking to were usually the ones willing to listen long enough to hear something real. He had served 3 years in the Pacific. He had done what was asked of him, and then some, in places whose names he rarely spoke aloud, under conditions that no letter home could adequately describe. He came back to Harlem in late September, and the neighborhood smelled exactly the same. That was the first thing he noticed stepping off the train, the specific smell of his block, unchanged, waiting. It felt like a mercy. He wasn't bitter, not yet. He was something rarer and more fragile than bitter. He was hopeful. He carried his discharge papers in the breast pocket of his uniform because he was proud of them, and pride in 1946, Harlem was something a black man wore carefully, like a good suit, present, intentional, but never so loud it invited trouble. He had a mother on 131st Street who had kept his room exactly as he left it. He had a girl named Estelle who had written him letters twice a week without fail, and had never once suggested in any of them that she might not wait. He had a dream that was modest in the way that honest dreams tend to be, a barbershop, his own chairs, his own name above his own door, a place where men from the neighborhood could sit down and feel like themselves. And on the morning of his first full day back, still in his uniform, still warm from the welcome his mother had given him the night before, Jimmy Caldwell walked down 8th Avenue toward Calloway's diner. He wanted coffee. He wanted eggs. He wanted a seat by the window. He had earned at least that much. Calloway's diner sat on a busy stretch of 8th Avenue like it belonged there, and in the way of many things in Harlem, it occupied black space without being a black-owned place. The sign had no particular politics. The windows were clean. The smell of coffee and bacon reached the sidewalk and made no distinction about who it was inviting. The owner was a man named Roy Pescatelli, heavyset, efficient, not unkind in his private life, but possessed of a particular belief that he had carried so long it had calcified into something he no longer examined. His policy was unspoken, as such policies often are, the kind that everyone in the room understands without anyone writing it down. Black patrons were served. They simply weren't seated. You placed your order at the counter, you received it in a bag, and you took it somewhere else. No confrontation, no explanation, just the quiet administration of a boundary that Roy Pescatelli had decided existed. Jimmy didn't know about the policy. He walked in and sat down at the counter the way a man sits down when he believes he has the right to sit, naturally, without ceremony, without performance. He set his cap on the counter beside him. He looked at the menu on the wall. The waitress, a young woman who was not cruel, but who had learned the rhythms of the room, froze at the sight of him. And then Roy Pescatelli came out from the back. He was not loud about it. That is the thing worth remembering. Loudness would have been almost easier, loudness you can meet on its own terms, but Pescatelli's voice was casual, almost gentle, the way a man sounds when he's saying something he said 100 times before. "We don't seat colored here. You can take something to go." Jimmy looked at the counter in front of him. He looked at his uniform. He thought briefly of the discharge papers in his breast pocket, the ones he had been planning to show his mother later because she had asked to see them. He stood up. He did not shout. He did not argue. He did not beg. He put his cap back on, turned, and walked out through the front door the same way he had walked in. But 8th Avenue was busy, and the window faced the street, and people saw. In Harlem, information does not travel the way it travels in other places. It does not require a telephone. It does not wait for a newspaper. It moves the way weather moves, present everywhere almost at once, felt before it is fully understood. By noon, the story of what happened at Calloway's diner had covered 6 blocks in every direction. It moved through a precise relay that only a neighborhood built on attention and memory could execute. The woman who saw it through the diner window told the man at the newsstand. The man at the newsstand told the barber setting up his morning station. The barber told the deacon coming down the church steps after morning prayer. And so it continued, block by block, mouth to ear, corner to stoop. What was remarkable was what the story did not lose in the telling. It did not become exaggerated. It did not acquire details it didn't have. Perhaps because the original was already too precise to improve upon, a man in uniform, just home, refused a seat. There was nothing to add. The truth was sufficient. By early afternoon, everyone within those 6 blocks knew Jimmy Caldwell's name. They knew he had served in the Pacific. They knew he was wearing his uniform. They knew he had walked out without a word. The beauty parlor on 127th Street was quiet in the particular way that meant everyone in a chair was thinking something they hadn't said yet. The kind of quiet that is louder than conversation. In Harlem, an insult is never a private matter. An insult aimed at one person lands on everyone who shares the shape of that person's life, the color of their skin, the particular weight of their daily navigation. The neighborhood understood without discussing it that what Pescatelli had said to Jimmy, he had in some sense said to all of them. And somewhere in the current of that information, moving from the newsstand to the barbershop, to the church, steps to the beauty parlor to the corner where the numbers ran, the story reached an ear it was, in some ways, always going to reach. The name passed to the right man at the right moment, the way certain things do in a neighborhood that has its own laws of gravity. Bumpy Johnson was at his regular table at a private social club on 133rd Street when Theodore brought him the news. Theodore was a careful-spoken man who ran numbers on the west side of the neighborhood and who had learned over years of proximity to Bumpy that the most valuable thing you could bring to that table was accuracy. Not speed, not drama, accuracy. He sat down, waited until Bumpy set his coffee cup back in its saucer, and then he told it straight. A veteran just returned. Uniform, 8th Avenue, Calloway's, refused a seat, walked out clean. Bumpy did not react the way a lesser man might have. There was no immediate table pounding, no performance of outrage designed to show the room how seriously he took it. He listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of respect, the acknowledgement that what was being said deserved to be heard before it was answered. He asked 2 questions. Was the man in uniform? Theodore said yes. Did he make a scene? Theodore said no. Bumpy was quiet for a long moment after that. Not the quiet of a man deciding whether something matters, but the quiet of a man who has already decided and is now considering how to respond. He finished his coffee. He straightened his jacket with the particular care of a man for whom appearance is a form of language. There are men who hear about an injustice and catch fire. Bumpy Johnson heard it and went still. And everyone who had spent any real time around him understood the difference. The anger was not gone, it had simply been taken somewhere internal and converted into something more useful, something patient, something that would last longer than a shout. He told Theodore to find Jimmy Caldwell. He didn't want a report. He didn't want a second-hand accounting. He wanted to speak to the man himself. Theodore left without asking why. He already knew why. They met on the stoop of Jimmy's mother's building as the afternoon light began its slow withdrawal from the street. Bumpy arrived without ceremony, no cars idling at the curb, no men flanking him, no signal to the block that anything significant was occurring. Just a well-dressed man in a good hat walking down the sidewalk and sitting down next to a veteran who didn't quite know what to make of the situation. Jimmy knew the name. Most people in Harlem knew the name, but knowing a name and knowing what to do with the man attached to it are different things. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't really what the moment called for, but he held himself carefully, the way you hold yourself when you're trying to read something before committing to how you feel about it. Bumpy didn't open with power. He opened with a question, and he asked it the way a man asks something he actually wants the answer to. I heard what happened. I'm not here to make it bigger than it is. I just want to know how you're carrying it. And Jimmy talked. He didn't talk long. He was not a man who used more words than a thing required, but he talked about the Pacific, about the particular texture of what he had seen and done there, about what it felt like to carry discharge papers in your pocket as proof of something that should need no proof, about coming home to a neighborhood that smelled the same and felt the same, and then walking into a counter and having the world remind you that sameness was not the same as welcome. Bumpy listened the way very few people had ever listened to Jimmy Caldwell, without waiting for a pause to insert his own experience, without the particular impatience of a man building his response while you're still building your sentence. He just listened. When Jimmy finished, Bumpy said, "You carried yourself right, that matters." He didn't make promises, he didn't threaten anything. He stood, straightened his hat, and walked back down the stoop and up the block. Jimmy watched him go and felt something he couldn't fully name, the way you feel when someone has quietly picked something up off the floor on your behalf without making you watch them do it. Something had been set in motion. Of that much, Jimmy was certain. Bumpy Johnson did not operate through rage. That was the thing people who only knew his reputation tended to misunderstand. Rage is loud and imprecise, and it announces itself before it arrives, which gives the other side time to prepare. What Bumpy operated through was something altogether different: information, patience, and the surgical application of pressure to the exact points where pressure would be felt most completely. He understood Pescatelli's situation the way a man understands something he has taken the time to actually examine. The diner sat on a black avenue. Its morning regulars were black workers. Its lunch crowd was black families. Its weekend trade was neighborhood children and their parents. The diner's supply chain ran through local distributors who had their own relationships, their own loyalties, their own calculations about who they wanted to be in business with and for how long. And the city's licensing apparatus, the inspectors, the renewal clerks, the ward-level officials who made small decisions that had large consequences. That apparatus was navigated by men who owed favors to other men, in the long chain of obligation that constitutes informal governance in any city that has ever actually worked. Bumpy knew where each thread ran. He had spent years learning the architecture of the invisible city that operated beneath the official one. He gathered his inner circle. Not many men, 3, each assigned a different layer of what was coming. He was precise with them. He told them what the objective was, and more importantly, he told them what it was not. We don't burn anything, we don't touch anyone, we let the man see what he's standing on. That was the instruction, not destruction. Revelation. He wanted Pescatelli to feel the ground shift beneath the diner, not because anything had been taken from him, but because he was being shown, for the first time, what had always been holding him up. The plan would take 1 week, it would leave no evidence, it would make no sound. Within 48 hours of Bumpy's quiet word, moving through the right channels in the right sequence, Calloway's diner began to notice a change that it did not yet have a name for. The early morning regulars stopped coming. The sanitation workers who had taken their coffee at that counter for years found, suddenly, that another corner suited them better. The postal clerks rerouted their breakfast. The nurses from Harlem Hospital, who had made the diner part of their shift change ritual, discovered a place 2 blocks over that had the same eggs and better light, and had never, to anyone's knowledge, told a soldier he wasn't welcome to sit down. The lunch crowd thinned to almost nothing by the second day. Women who had sent their children for weekend pie were occupied with other things. Men who stopped in out of habit found the habit had quietly left them. Pescatelli watched his counter empty out and did what a man does when he doesn't yet understand what's happening. He looked for obvious explanations. A health rumor, a competitor's promotion, something wrong with the coffee. He found nothing, because there was nothing visible to find. What was happening was not a protest. There were no signs. There were no gatherings on the sidewalk, no speeches, no organized announcement of any kind. There was simply an absence, the neighborhood removing itself with the same quiet efficiency with which it had always been present. No shouting, no broken windows, no picket lines, just the slow, steady withdrawal of a community that had decided a man who refuses a soldier a seat does not deserve their coins. By the third day, Pescatelli was asking his staff what they knew. His staff, for various reasons, had nothing useful to offer. Some of them had heard something, none of them said so. The diner sat on an avenue it had always taken for granted, and the avenue, for the first time, was demonstrating what it meant to actually be taken for granted. On a Tuesday morning, a city inspector arrived at Calloway's diner. He was polite. He was thorough. He had a clipboard and a manner that suggested he was simply doing what city inspectors do, which is to look carefully at things that have not been looked at carefully in some time. He found 3 violations, none of them catastrophic in isolation: a ventilation irregularity in the kitchen, a storage issue in the back room, a discrepancy in the fire safety documentation. Each one correctable, but each one requiring correction before the upcoming license renewal could proceed without complication. That same afternoon, Pescatelli received a letter from his primary food supplier. A temporary shortage, the letter explained. Several staple items would be unavailable for delivery for the foreseeable future. The supplier regretted the inconvenience. Separately, these were the ordinary frictions of running a business in a city that generates paperwork the way some neighborhoods generate noise. Together, layered on top of a customer base that had inexplicably evaporated over the previous 48 hours, they began to form a shape that Pescatelli was now, finally, beginning to read. He made inquiries at the ward level. The conversations he had were brief and vague in a way that told him more than detail would have. Vagueness, in these situations, is its own communication. When men who normally have answers become men who have only shrugs, the shrug is the answer. Justice in 1946, Harlem rarely arrived through courtrooms. Courtrooms were buildings you went to when the city wanted something from you. What justice for Harlem looked like was different. It looked like a careful hand reaching into the invisible machinery of the city and turning the appropriate wheels in a direction they did not usually turn. It did not require violence. It did not require exposure. It required only knowledge of who owed what to whom, and which obligations, applied with precision, would produce the desired result. Bumpy Johnson called it simply making the air uncomfortable, and the air, for Roy Pescatelli, had become very uncomfortable indeed. Roy Pescatelli was not a foolish man. That was perhaps the one quality that saved him from a situation that could have extended considerably longer than it did. He understood, by the end of the first week, that what was happening to his diner was not coincidence and not accident, and not the random bad fortune that sometimes befalls a business for no reason anyone can name. Something was being done, deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing. Through a mutual contact, a man who operated in that middle ground that exists in every city between the official world and the unofficial one, Pescatelli arranged a meeting. He came to the social club on 133rd Street without an entourage, without theater, without anything that could be read as aggression. He came alone. He sat down across from Bumpy Johnson in a room that was warm and dim and smelled of coffee and tobacco. He did not open with an apology. He opened with a business question, which was the only kind of opening he knew. Is there something I've done that's caused a problem? Bumpy let the silence sit between them for a long moment. Not cruelly, there was nothing theatrical about it. He simply allowed the question to exist in the air for long enough that Pescatelli felt the full weight of having had to ask it. Then he spoke, calmly, almost pleasantly. He explained, in the measured tone of a man discussing something that ought to have been obvious from the beginning, that the neighborhood had a long memory and a specific relationship with the concept of respect. He said Jimmy Caldwell's name. He said the word uniform. He said, that man bled for a flag you put in your window every 4th of July. Pescatelli began to speak. Bumpy raised one hand, not as a threat, not as a performance of power, but simply as the gesture of a man who has not yet finished, and said, I'm not asking for much. Harlem is asking for the same thing it always asked for, to be treated like it belongs here. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Pescatelli left the way he came, alone, quietly, with no one on the street paying him any particular attention, but he left carrying something he had not arrived with, an understanding, an accounting, a very clear sense of what the next step needed to be. 1 week and 2 days after James, Caldwell walked out of Calloway's diner with his head held and his mouth closed. A small handwritten sign appeared in the front window. It was not elaborate. It was not framed. It was not accompanied by a press release or a public statement or any form of ceremony whatsoever. It read, in plain letters on a piece of cardboard, all patrons welcome. In another neighborhood, in another set of circumstances, such a sign might have passed unnoticed, a routine declaration, the kind of thing a new business posts on its first day and never thinks about again. In Harlem, in the autumn of 1946, it was read with the attention usually reserved for scripture. The barbershop noticed, the beauty parlor noticed, the deacon noticed, the women in their weekday hats noticed, the man at the newsstand noticed and said nothing, which in Harlem means you noticed it very much. In a neighborhood where people have spent generations learning to read silence, they also know how to read a sign. They understood what it meant, not just the words on the cardboard, but the fact of its existence, what had preceded it, what had made it necessary, what it represented in the long and ongoing negotiation between a community and a world that frequently underestimated it. Slowly, not all at once, not in a rush that would have felt like forgiveness, people began to return to the diner. They returned not because they had forgotten, but because the neighborhood had made its point, and the point had been acknowledged, and a community that understood the difference between vengeance and justice chose, as it usually did, justice. Pescatelli never fully understood the mechanism that had pressured him. He knew results. He knew the inspector had come. He knew the deliveries had been disrupted. He knew the customers had left, and then, after the sign, returned. But the architecture of what had happened, the patience of it, the precision of it, the way a neighborhood had organized itself around the dignity of one man in a uniform that he never grasped. Jimmy Caldwell heard about the sign from Estelle, who heard it from the beauty parlor on 127th. He did not go back to that diner, he never did, but he knew what the sign meant, and knowing was enough. 1 week and 2 days after James, Caldwell walked out of Calloway's diner with his head held and his mouth closed. A small handwritten sign appeared in the front window. It was not elaborate. It was not framed. It was not accompanied by a press release or a public statement or any form of ceremony whatsoever. It read, in plain letters on a piece of cardboard, all patrons welcome. In another neighborhood, in another set of circumstances, such a sign might have passed unnoticed, a routine declaration, the kind of thing a new business posts on its first day and never thinks about again. In Harlem, in the autumn of 1946, it was read with the attention usually reserved for scripture. The barbershop noticed, the beauty parlor noticed, the deacon noticed, the women in their weekday hats noticed, the man at the newsstand noticed and said nothing, which in Harlem means you noticed it very much. In a neighborhood where people have spent generations learning to read silence, they also know how to read a sign. They understood what it meant, not just the words on the cardboard, but the fact of its existence, what had preceded it, what had made it necessary, what it represented in the long and ongoing negotiation between a community and a world that frequently underestimated it. Slowly, not all at once, not in a rush that would have felt like forgiveness, people began to return to the diner. They returned not because they had forgotten, but because the neighborhood had made its point, and the point had been acknowledged, and a community that understood the difference between vengeance and justice chose, as it usually did, justice. Pescatelli never fully understood the mechanism that had pressured him. He knew results. He knew the inspector had come. He knew the deliveries had been disrupted. He knew the customers had left, and then, after the sign, returned. But the architecture of what had happened, the patience of it, the precision of it, the way a neighborhood had organized itself around the dignity of one man in a uniform that he never grasped. Jimmy Caldwell heard about the sign from Estelle, who heard it from the beauty parlor on 127th. He did not go back to that diner, he never did, but he knew what the sign meant, and knowing was enough. There is a particular kind of story that a neighborhood tells not because it ended well, but because it tells the truth about who the neighborhood was when it mattered. This is one of those stories. Harlem in 1946 was not a place of easy living. It was a place of hard-won dignity, of daily navigation, of a community that had learned through long experience that the city would not always show up on its behalf, and had therefore developed, over generations, its own systems of justice, its own networks of accountability, its own methods of making the world behave in ways the law was too slow or too indifferent to enforce. It was imperfect. It was complicated. It was, in the way of all real things, neither entirely one thing nor entirely another. Bumpy Johnson lived inside that complexity. People want to make him simple, a gangster, a criminal, a cautionary tale, a legend with no human edges, but Harlem knew him differently. Harlem knew him as a man who showed up when the city didn't, who understood that power unconnected to community is just violence with better clothes, who looked at a veteran, refused a seat, and saw not an opportunity, but an obligation. He was not a saint. He would have been the first to say so, and he would have said it without apology. But he understood something about the neighborhood that sustained him, that a community's dignity is not divisible. That when you insult one person on one avenue on one autumn morning, you have made a statement about everyone who shares that avenue, that neighborhood, that particular weight of living in a world that rarely makes things easy. And that statement, if left unanswered, becomes a policy. And a policy, left unchallenged, becomes a wall. Harlem did not build walls. Harlem built barbershops. Jimmy Caldwell went home. He built his shop. He married Estelle. He cut hair for 30 years on 130th Street and never once asked anyone to remember what had happened to him on 8th Avenue, because he understood that the neighborhood already did. The measure of a community is not how it treats its powerful. It is how it treats the man who comes home in his uniform and asks for nothing more than a seat by the window. Harlem remembered. And now, so do you.